Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Science and Cocktails. Science and Cocktails is an initiative that tries to bring scientific lectures and music art performances combined with high-class dry ice cocktails. Its aim is to spread knowledge and have a good time while doing it. Tonight's final teleportation of this autumn season will be guided by Kåre Mølbak, medical doctor, researcher, and director of the Department of Infectious Disease Epidemiology of the Statens Serum Institute in Copenhagen. He will review certain pieces of human history in which humankind was hit by several outbursts of infectious diseases, such as the Black Death and the Spanish flu. In particular, he will tell you how to defeat these awful viruses that go in the air by kicking it right in the balls. Motherfucker. He will explain that when such outbreaks of infectious diseases do occur on Earth, they do not only constitute a threat, but they also constitute an opportunity for studying and controlling infectious diseases. And that is why we know that methods such as whacking with your feet the virus can work. So take it. Yeah! Kåre Mølbak will finish this evening by placing the current epidemic, Ebola, in West Africa into perspective, and he will explain exactly how we can kill this virus. And this is as follows. Transmission.
Wow, what an introduction. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. My name is Kåre Mølbak, and I'm working with surveillance of infectious diseases at SSI in Denmark, and part of the Danish response against epidemics. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. There is a center in Stockholm called the European Center for Disease Control, ECDC. They have one in the United States that's just CDC. And each Friday I receive a communicable disease threat report where the following threat has been reported. So there's influenza in Europe, there's an outbreak of enterovirus D68 in USA and Canada, there's the Ebola thing in West Africa, there's actually another Ebola virus outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo, much smaller, Marburg fever in Uganda, poliomyelitis in the world due to the concerns about Syria. We have the Middle East respiratory tract syndrome, which is a SARS-like disease in Arab. We have influenza A, H5N1. We have a large outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in Portugal. It's deemed to be the third largest outbreak of Legionnaire's disease so far. And then they're concerned about West Nile virus, which is spreading due to climate change. And then we have a new strain, H7N9 of influenza in China that is transmitted to humans. So have a nice weekend. Yeah. this is what we're going to talk about today. And of course, when I prepared this talk, then list was outdated because the Netherlands once again a very contagious halopathogenic avian influenza, which is H5N8 in the Netherlands and Germany and also in Britain. So there's much to be concerned about. And then this, of course, does not mention the epidemics that we do not longer consider as epidemics or are not perhaps in your mind as epidemics, but we have the HIV/AIDS epidemic that I'll come back to. And we have antimicrobial resistant threats that could be extreme resistance, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. We have gram-negative bacteria such as E. coli that is virtually impossible to treat now due to carbapenem resistance. We have MRSA that you can read about in the newspapers. And then we have changes of distribution of infectious due to environmental changes or climate. So there's much ado about something. So why are we concerned about epidemics? That's because any epidemic is some kind of sign or warning of a breakdown of public health. So you can say, if you take that perspective, then nothing is really more important than epidemics. And we need to understand the cause of the epidemic in order to stop or control it, in order to protect public health. So that's why we are here. We want to protect public health. That's the aim of my department and my institute and the people I work with throughout the world. All right. But there's more to it than that, and that was actually already alluded to in this introductory video, because much of what we know about infectious diseases stems from well-investigated diseases or outbreaks. So we learn a lot from studying epidemics. And to address epidemics from various disciplines. So that's why it's great to be in such a diverse audience as tonight, because we need to address it from the perspective of the microbiologist, the epidemiologist, the social scientist, the anthropologist, the data manager, the statistician, and the bioinformatics, and so on and so forth. So by studying epidemics, we really have a chance of having people working in various scientific disciplines to get together. Then there's often this high political pressure to investigate and stop an epidemic. So as a head of the department, I would make a wrong decision if I choose to make a low priority to the investigation of an outbreak or epidemic. And it's an opportunity to learn applied epidemiology. It's really one of the best ways to learn epidemiology in real life, that is to study epidemics. And then epidemics has this narrative content. You just read the Bible. There's a lot of good stories about epidemics. So epidemics has been thought about a way to clean society. It can mark a change to a new age, or it can just be a story to tell around a dinner table. So there's really good stories behind epidemics. And just look at this picture that you can see at the Prado Museum in Madrid. This is the Triumph of Death, painted by Peter Bruegel the Older in 1500th century, that shows the aftermath of a plague epidemic where the dead bodies are transported along the river and so on. There are a lot of details to study in this. It's just that's a sign about the narrative content of epidemics. So what is an outbreak or an epidemic? Actually, as an epidemiologist, we don't consider the difference between an outbreak and epidemic or an epidemic. An epidemic sounds a little more fancy. It has a larger sort of journalistic, but in fact it is by definition the same. It's the occurrence of more cases of diseases than normally expected within a specific place or group of people over a given period of time, meaning that you have to have a surveillance system where you can follow a disease, a trend of disease over time, and then by doing mathematical calculations or tracking clusters, you can detect the occurrence of a new disease. And that's really a key to control the epidemic, that is, to detect it as early as possible. It is in reality really difficult to predict about epidemics, but you can run a surveillance system and then you can detect a new pathogen or an increase in existing pathogen as early as possible in order to prevent it. And the key concept in this connection is R naught, the basic reproductive number. And that's a concept that shows how many new cases that will be created by a single primary case in a susceptible population. So that's a concept about how contagious a disease is. So given that we have a new virus, virus X, and you are all susceptible to that virus, it's introduced into this room, the number of people who will pick up this virus will be the R naught of this new virus. And that shows something about the basic concepts of the virus in a given population. So this is an illustration of the initial phase of an epidemic with an R naught of 3. So the first case will have 3 secondary cases, and each case will have 3 more. So the second generation will contain a total of 9 cases. And from there, it will spread following an exponential formula, until there is some kind of immunity developed in the population or other control measures are applied. So understand R naught of an epidemic will also tell you about how realistic it is to obtain control within a given period. And then we talk about a disease that is endemic when R, the effective reproduction rate, equals 1 or is below 1, because we have the same disease here. There are, in theory, 3 people that can be affected, but these 2 people, they are no longer susceptible, perhaps because they have been vaccinated, perhaps because they are using some protective measures so they don't pick up the agent. And then, of course, there will still be an ongoing chain of transmission, but we will no longer see the epidemic. And this is the kind of concept that is behind most of the mathematical models that we use of epidemics. And I'll not dwell into these models today, but it's just to let you know that when we talk about how easy it is or how feasible it is to control an epidemic, then it's based on such consideration. So as long as the effective reproductive rate is above 1, we'll see an increase, and then once control measures are applied, it will fall down again, and then there could be an endemic state where we see a constant occurrence of cases with an effective reproductive number around 1, right? So these are simulated data for influenza epidemics. So this could be the Spanish flu, R naught around 1.6, and this is the Spanish flu epidemic in the fall of 1918 that fits quite well with these data. And this is how it would look if R naught is 1.3. So from the shape of the epidemic curve, this is a key concept, the epidemic curve. You are able to calculate the reproductive number, and that shows the number of people that you need to put into isolation or to vaccinate in order to stop the epidemic. We have the big historical epidemics like the Black Death, which I'll come back to, that was caused by Yersinia pestis, and where we actually can follow that back to the Roman time with the Justinian epidemics in around 540. We have cholera epidemics. That was an important incentive for the sanitary revolution. So if we talk about the 19th century Copenhagen, there were huge cholera epidemics, and they actually served as the incentive, prompted the sanitary revolution in Copenhagen, where people got better water supply, better sanitation, and a better housing condition. But it's still ongoing threat to countries with lack of water and sanitation. And then we have the Spanish flu, which is perhaps the most devastating epidemic so far, that at least what we know about. And then we have the polio-epidemics in the 1950s that we shouldn't forget about. So the 1950s can be remembered from the birth of rock and roll and from the Cold War, but certainly also from the polio-epidemics. So these are just a few historical epidemics. But in reality, ladies and gentlemen, none of these diseases have been eradicated. The only disease that has been eradicated is smallpox. These diseases do still exist. And this is just to show how the plague spread in Europe. So it actually came over from Asia along the Silk Road, and then from the Black Sea it was transported by ships to Italy, where it arrived, and then it spread within a few years up to Scandinavia and up to Norway and Scotland. Left some areas with only very few cases. And there were social rises in many cities throughout Europe at that time. So it was a cause of social uprising and political tensions, as we saw in the HIV epidemics. And as we see now in the Ebola epidemics in West Africa. So that's why I say if you want to work with epidemics, it's also important to have this social science perspective to it. So what is plague then? Well, it's a bacteria that is carried by rodents, such as rat, but also other types of rodent can carry it. And then flea drinks rat blood that carries the bacteria, and the bacteria start to multiply in the flea's gut. Flea, that's lopper in Danish. And then the gut get clogged with the bacteria, and then the flea bites again the humans, and then it vomits blood into the open wound, and then the human is infected. So this is the basic cycle of Yersinia pestis, and it can have various forms, such as bubonic plague, which is why it was called the Black Death, because they are black abscesses on the body. It can also have a pulmonary form, and you can get bloodstream infection for it. It's a highly lethal disease without antibiotic treatments. In 1347, when the Black Death hit Europe, there was an estimated population of 75 million in Europe, and that was actually reduced down to around 50 million. So it was 25 million, or a third of the population that died in just under 5 years between 1347 and 1352. So no wonder that it had a tremendous importance for the society as a whole, and that was reflected in art and in literature, in music, in philosophy, and of course also in medical science, and gave rise to political rises. So where is plague now? Well, it's actually common in areas of, or not common, but it's present in areas of Asia and Africa, also a little in Latin America, and in the United States, where it's present in ground squirrels. So take care if you go to the western part of the United States in order to hunt ground squirrels. It's only a few thousand cases each year, so of course we're not talking about the Black Death, but there are news, and journalists now and then call me to ask about, so what is this about plague in Europe, or hunters in the desert in Arizona that gets plague. Okay. The big one was really the great influenza pandemic, 1918 to 20, and this shows a historical photo of the Spanish influenza ward at Camp Funston in Kansas, where some people thought that it came from. Why is it called the Spanish flu? It is because there were no free press during the First World War. So all the countries that were in war were not allowed to disclose that there has this dreadful influenza epidemic going on. So they kept silent. But Spain was neutral, so they informed about it that, hey, we have people dying from influenza, young, completely healthy men and women are dying from this dreadful disease. So that's why it was called the Spanish flu. So it has absolutely no special connection with Spain. And it infected at least 500 million people, and there are various estimates about how many it killed. So that can be from anything from 50 to 100 million. And it remains a prototype of a worst-case scenario of an influenza pandemic. Now, influenza is an RNA virus that that constantly changes, and it can change by antigenic shift, which is a big change where it sort of reassort its genetic component, and we have a brand new virus, or there can be small changes along the way, and such a pandemic will come when we have this, or can come, may come. There's a threat that it can come when we have this antigenic shift. And that shit, So this is really when the shit hits the fan, and instead of showing the modern curves, so of course there have been a lot of studies, both epidemiological and sociological and microbiological of the Spanish flu, but these are actually original epidemic curves of mortality in various European cities. Now, then we had the polio-epidemics, as I said, in the 1950s, and then there were a lot of researchers who said, now we can close the book. So following the polio-epidemics and invention of antibiotics and vaccines, then it was the time to close the book of infectious diseases. And when I started to study medicine, people told me, Kåre, there's no future in infectious diseases. Don't think about it at all. It's a waste of time. Unless you want to save the poor people in Africa, then there is no concern about infectious diseases. And even Sir Frank Burnett, who actually spent his whole life working with infectious diseases, he invented or discovered Coxiella burnetii, which is the cause of Q fever, which just a few years ago caused big epidemics in the Netherlands. That's a zoonotic infection transmitted from animals, in this case goats, to human beings in big areas in the Netherlands. So well, that was another story, but he discovered, he was a great microbiologist, received the Nobel Prize, and he discovered many bacteria, including this Coxiella burnetii, that got his name. So he said that one can think of the middle of the 20th century as the end of one of the most important social revolutions in history, the virtual elimination of the infectious diseases as a significant factor in social life. So what came next? HIV/AIDS, which caused a tremendous change in society. And I just put a few pictures. So this is from 1987, when Reagan was in the White House, and he didn't put the word in his mouth about this gay-associated syndrome. And 1987, that was also the year when the first drug against retrovirus or HIV was invented, ACT. And this quilt, one of these quilt, represent one death due to the epidemics. So of course there's a lot of political content or sociological content into this epidemic, this link between politics, sexuality, blood and death. And now there's an estimated 39 million people who have died from AIDS. It's actually more than died during the Black Death. And of course it was a much smaller population that So relatively speaking, then this is not as serious, but it's certainly serious enough. And one can think about that. Could it have been prevented from the start if we had discovered it early on, if we had surveillance systems that could pick it up, and if we could intervene against it? And I think there will, of course, be another HIV/AIDS epidemic. There will be another Ebola. There will be another SARS. Perhaps not in my lifetime, but there will come the really big one again. So that's why we can't close the book. We have to keep it open, right? So then because researchers started to realize that we can't close the book, then the Institute of Medicine in the United States, they developed this concept of emerging infectious diseases, which include diseases whose rates of incidence have increased within the previous 2 years, or those with the potential of rate increases in near future. So they could be new infections from changes or evolutions of existing organisms like bacteria. They multiply every 20 minutes if they work under good conditions. So there is an enormous potential of changes. And I just talked about the influenza virus that is constantly changing because it's an RNA virus. So there's no proofreading. It just multiplies with a lot of random changes. Or it could be known infections spreading to new geographical areas or populations. It could be previously unrecognized infections that suddenly is picked up by the radar, or it could be old infections re-emerging. So that's included in this concept of emerging diseases, and they respect no boundaries. And certainly there are numerous examples. And of course, I'll not go into all these examples, but we see the antimicrobial drug-resistant threat. We see re-emerging of a lot of diseases in the United States where it's picked up. We see, for example, we see here cryptosporidiosis causing big waterborne outbreak. We see the E. coli 0104H4 epidemic in Germany. And we see many other diseases. We see a lot of viruses coming out of Asia. We see the SARS epidemic here. Sometimes I tend to call it postmodern pathogens and not emerging diseases, because one can actually think about those in various ways. So some of these are really the big fat ones that are really important for public health, whereas others may perhaps be more important for the journalist or CNN than really for public health. I think it's important to put all these into different perspectives. But this focus that we have of infectious threats is the mindset of modern sociology, where we talk about a society that is stripped from its capacity to function in a linear state and out of tradition. So we have no longer real progress in this society. It's just all about processes, because we will have food on our table anyway at the end of the day. So the constant change becomes the status quo, and it relates to important sociological concepts such as globalization, reflexivity, and risk society, where there's this focus a lot on the risk. And of course, I get my salary from focusing on the risk. But I think it's important to understand there are more to it than that. And this is not really my field of expertise, but I have an interest in it, and I think it's important also to have this sociological perspective on what we are doing. So this is a real postmodern pathogen. So there was an important disease in the United States, typhoid fever, that people actually were dying from, and there were enormous problems with typhoid fever in the 20s and 30s in the United States, at a time when it actually had a pretty low incidence in Denmark. So milk was pasteurized, and the chlorination was, water was chlorinated, and there was safe canning. So that was the developing of the modern society that ended around 45, where we moved into the postmodern age. And what did we see in the postmodern age? Well, we saw all the non-typhoid salmonellosis appearing, which of course is a much milder disease. So these two curves cannot really be compared, but nonetheless it became out as a big concern for consumer, and indeed causes a lot of morbidity and mortality. This peak here is a big milk-borne outbreak in '85. And we can see a little bit of the same curve as from Denmark, where we had outbreaks in the 50s from København Salatfabrik that supplied Irma with various delicacies, and then we have epidemics from broilers and porks and eggs. We have a big outbreak again in 2008, and that's actually going down. So that's one of the public health success stories in Denmark, the control of salmonella. But I would characterize this as a postmodern pathogen and not really as one of the big fat one. Okay, but this is one of the big fat one. That is really when the shit hits the fan with the SARS epidemic, and that was one of the few moments where I was concerned what will happen. But that was actually fought with the classical measures of fighting infectious diseases. Isolation of patients and quarantine, basic hygienic principles, the same as was used in the fight against the plague. So it caused about 8,000 cases and 750 deaths. And that could have been much worse. And what we saw was this super spreading event. So there was one event in a hotel in Hong Kong where there came a traveler from the Guangdong province in China to this hotel, from where it spread to Hong Kong. It spread to Vietnam because that was an international hotel, and these people have shared an elevator. It spread to Singapore, it spread to United States, and it spread to Ireland, and it spread to Canada. And in particular, the outbreak in Canada caused actually a lot of problems. So this is the epidemic curve from Canada, and it actually came into two phases and disrupted much of the healthcare sector in Toronto. And this second phase came because they have overlooked one case only. So that's enough to create a resurgence of the epidemic. So certainly one should be aware when you have such a situation. Now, many of these infections that we talk about, including SARS, they are zoonotic infections. That is, infections that are transferred from animals to human beings, and then perhaps or perhaps not, they have the potential of transmitting further on between humans. And that's why it's important that people with the veterinary background and people with a background in human medicine, they work together in order to understand these problems. And that, of course, will lead me into the last part of my talk, which is about Ebola in West Africa. And here we see the reservoir of the virus. These are fruit bats hanging in a cave. So there is a circle of transmission of Ebola viruses within the fruit bats. We do not have fruit bats in Denmark, so don't be concerned. And eventually it may spread into a different kind of animals. So primates can easily pick it up, but also other kinds of animals. So if a monkey and a fruit bat is sitting in a mango tree together, then they have the chance the monkey has the chance of getting the virus from the bat. And then eventually it may spread to humans, for example, because they consume bushmeat or get in contact with an animal. So it's not actually from consuming the meat, but rather from handling the animal that has the virus in its bodily fluids. So basic epidemiology tells us that the virus is transmitted through direct contact with bodily fluids. That is primarily blood, feces, and vomit from symptomatic patients. It can also be other bodily fluids, but it's mainly those three fluids. There's no airborne transmission. It's only in Hollywood that can imagine airborne transmission. We cannot so far, and we hope certainly that it stays the same like that. The incubation period varies up to 21 days. So that's one thing that people have learned about Ebola. That's max incubation period, 21 days. Virus is only shed from symptomatic patients. So that's the good news. It's not like a disease like influenza where people can shed it before they start to develop symptoms. So this means that a lot of transmission takes place from patients who are in the late state of diseases. So that's people who are cared for in hospitals where the hospital workers do not protect themselves from getting the infections, or have no means to protect themselves from having the infection, or from people who are dead and where they are buried in traditional ways. And of course, it's not a new disease. It was discovered in 76 in Zaire, as it was called at that time, Democratic Republic of Congo. And then there have been various other outbreaks. So the red one, that's the Zaire strain, and then there's another strain called the Sudan strain that has been in this part of Africa. And all these outbreaks have been relatively small, and they have been contained by these classical measures of epidemic control, isolation and quarantine. And in fact, in many of these situations, the population itself they have stayed in their villages. They have heard there's an infectious disease in the area, a severe one, and we need to stay in our villages in order to avoid getting infected. So this is completely the opposite of what happened in the current outbreak, as I'll get back to. So the strategy of containment is to isolate cases, monitor close contacts for fever, but that of course needs that you have laboratory facilities in order to detect the cases, you have treatment facilities in order to isolate the cases, and you have resources for contact tracing, safe burials of bodies, and social mobilization, education. And as I said, previous outbreaks have been contained that way. So we know how to deal with this outbreak, but the problem is that means are insufficient in the current outbreak, which started in late 2013. So people have identified patient 0, which was a 2-year-old child that probably had been exposed to some kind of bushmeat, and then you can track it down from this patient 0 in a chain of transmission in Guinea, in West Africa. And people who were at risk are those that we expect to be at risk, namely family members who have given care to infected individuals, persons who have taken part in traditional burials. A burial in this society is the most important event in a life, and you have to go back to the village where you come from, where your ancestors come from, and get buried following the traditional the tradition. Otherwise you will not rest in peace, and the whole tribe and clan will not have a good future. So it's really important to bury according to this tradition, and that's one of the big dilemmas in this outbreak. And of course, healthcare workers are also at risk. So this is the epidemic curve in the latest update by 14 November, and actually this is a rolling average, and it appears that there is a break now. So perhaps there is hope now. Perhaps we finally have seen the peak of the epidemic curve, but it is difficult to say precisely because there are so many uncertainties about these data. But there's a little light of hope in the tunnel. What is important to underscore is that it's actually 4%, 570 of these cases that have been occurred among healthcare workers. So it has been really a heavy strain for the healthcare system in the 3 affected countries, which are Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. And the actual epicenter of the outbreak was in this part where the 3 countries meet each other, where Guinea meets Sierra Leone and where it meets Liberia. And one of the explanations of the late response to this epidemic is because there has been no coordinated response between these 3 countries. They have different legislation, different tradition, different languages, and in particular, Liberia has a very, very weak public health tradition, but also the others have no strong tradition. And then, as I said, it's important to respect the traditions of burial. So there's been a lot of movement across the borders or between the capitals and the villages, which led to a rapid and unprecedented geographical spread of cases. And on this map, you can see epidemic curves in different counties. So some are going up and some are going down. And I think, as I said, this is the perfect storm because it's first time West Africa had an Ebola outbreak. There was this extremely weak healthcare sector, highly mobile populations, and they do not respect borders because all these borders are very porous. Mistrust to the authorities, and then the ceremonial burials. And then there was also a slow international outbreak response. So Doctors Without Borders, they were aware of the situations, but they couldn't really get into contact with WHO. So there was an extreme slow international response. Insufficient surveillance, so there were no data to guide the response to breakdown of the healthcare sector, and then almost lack of everything, which meant that the case finding was insufficient, contact tracing was not existing, and probably is still non-existing in many places. And this is the kind of environment where this outbreak took place. So this is the West Point slum in Monrovia, where I actually worked many years ago. This is a slum in Freetown in Sierra Leone. These are a couple of images, and I think, how would you react if you saw these people in your village and didn't know anything about Ebola? I mean, it reminds about those doctors or working with the plague masks in the plague epidemics during the Black Death. And this is the kind of scenery you see where bodies or sick people are laying in the ground. This is the John F. Kennedy Hospital Ebola Clinic in Monrovia with 2 people lying again on the ground. This is a community care center in Sierra Leone, just lying on the floor. So these are really strong pictures. So how will it develop? There have been various estimates or predictions of how it will develop. Now, this scale has been turned into a log scale because we are still, or when this slide was made, we were at least at the exponential part of the curve, and perhaps it has peaked now. I don't know, but I think there may be hope. It has been modeled in a mathematical model that if 70% of the cases are isolated and 70% of burials are safe, then the curve can be broken, and that has been the aim of the current intervention. So support is on its way. It takes time. There's transmission stable in Guinea. It's declining in Liberia, increasing at least in parts of Sierra Leone. What is a concern is that in the last few days there have been a cluster in Mali, 6 cases now, and so that's a big concern that there could be another wave there. There have been success stories in Nigeria and Senegal where it has been contained, and then it will have long-term consequences because the healthcare sector has been broken down, and that has consequences, for example, safe birth, treatments of common ailments and disorders, malaria, maintaining the vaccine prevention program or the vaccine program and controlling vaccine preventable diseases. There are some treatments on the way, and there are trials with new vaccines, but these are not easily, these are not quick fix solutions because there is simply no healthcare sector that can support the delivery of those technologies. So sometimes people, a little bit naive, ask me, so why don't we just build more hospitals, or why don't we just invent drugs or vaccines? But we need also a system and organization that can deliver those services. So that's why it's important to have this social science perspective to the problem as well. So it's like building a car and putting them in a country where there's no roads. Then it's not of much use. I think to sum up, and time has indeed come to sum up. Then it was not health care science or doctors only who fought the great epidemics. So if we look at the fight against polio, the fight against tuberculosis, the fight against cholera and so on, it was safe water, it was basic sanitation, better living condition, nutrition, schooling, equity in terms of equity between genders, equity between sexual preferences, equity between social class and so on, access to schools, access to healthcare, access to vaccines that paved the way. But I mentioned vaccines, so of course, science has a role to play, but we shouldn't overestimate the role of the medical sciences, because it is more the development of society in general that is the key to the control of epidemics and other infectious diseases. And then I put in also the word of sustainability, because we need to develop sustainable way of doing agriculture, sustainable way of producing foods, sustainable ways of using drugs for humans as well, in order to protect the remedies, the drugs that we have. So that's part of the solution as well. But of course, we also need medical science or healthcare. We need to maintain and develop a strong tradition in intervention epidemiology. We need disease detectives that can track the causes of epidemics and provide the data that we need in order to control the epidemics. We need microbiology, we need drugs. We also need the pharmaceutical industry. We need the vaccines, we need IT, and there are tremendous possibilities in using big data, and I think we're just beginning to understand the use of big data. And then we need a One Health approach, where people concerned with environment and with animal health and human health should work together. And this is, of course, a dream. But I'll end with another quotation by another Burnett. And I mean, you can find a lot of poems, but this is made by Burnett, not the Nobel laureate, but Dana Burnett, which I think is a coincidence. But the dreamer dies, but never dies the dream. Though death shall call the whirlwind to its aid, enlist men's passion, trick their hearts with hate, still shall the vision live. Say nevermore that dreams are fragile things. Say nevermore that dreams are fragile things. What else endures of all these broken worlds save only dreams? Thank you for your attention.